All right, but now let's think about another security risk is about an on-path eavesdropper. So let's say that there's an attacker that can eavesdrop on our traffic and is on path. Okay, and we're looking up, we're resolving some domain name. What can they do? Let's say that the domain, the DNS, the name servers are all honest. And I'm trying to resolve, again, ecs.mit.edu. But there's an on-path attacker. What can they do? Yeah? Yeah, exactly. A non-path attacker sees your request, sees you're interested in ecs.mit.edu, is going to reply back and say, oh, this is the IP address of ecs.mit.edu. And you're going to accept that, and it could be an incorrect IP address of an attacker. And why can they reply? What piece of information can they see from the request that enables them to reply? Yeah. The ID number, exactly. A non-path attacker is going to see the ID number on the request, take that, read that ID number, put it in the reply, and respond with a fake IP address. And then, the victim is going to accept it because it's the correct ID number. So this is something that they can do. And again, we'll see later that TLS really helps prevent this. But without TLS, you're up for this attacker. So the interesting question is, okay, but that attacker has to be on path. How about all the other attackers in the world, the off-path attackers? What can they do? They can't eavesdrop on our traffic because they're not on path. So they won't see the ID number. But can they still reply with DNS responses? And so it is still possible, and it's called blind spoofing. So before it was spoofing a DNS request because you're creating a fake one. But blind spoofing is when you're spoofing something without seeing the request. And so I'm going to give you some examples of how blind spoofing works and then discuss some mitigations that people are currently using to prevent it. So let's take a look a little bit again at the network packet. In particular, we're just going to look above the IP layer, so the UDP header and then the whole DNS payload. And say that we want to look up mail.google.com. And the question is, how can an off-path attacker feed us a bogus answer before the legitimate server replies? Okay. So how can such a remote attacker even know we are looking up mail.google.com? Let's first answer this question, then we can see how to spoof a reply. So how can a remote attacker know that we are trying to look up mail.google.com? So one simple possibility is to, make us do that. How? Well, let's say by mistake we visit a web page under their control. We just surf the web and get on, their web page. cutekitties.com or something. And so all you need to do, and we'll get to web security and you'll understand that, but all you need to do, the attacker needs to do, is that in this web page, there can be something of this sort, that basically an image is loaded from mail.google.com. Because when your browser, loads such a web page, it's going to want to resolve mail.google.com to be able to contact the server and load the image. Okay? So we'll learn more about this in web security, but the high-level bit is that all that the attacker has to do is to get you to visit one of their pages. That page will have a link to mail.google.com where you're supposed to load an image from. So your browser is going to try to resolve the domain name and figure out the IP address so it actually loads the image. Okay, so now the attacker knows that we're going to mail.google.com and we're going to try to resolve that. Okay, so it knows that much. So now we have to see how the attacker can actually spoof a response, and really the problem is how to use spoofed ID, right? That's really the question, because you need to get the ID to match the one from the request from the browser. If they match, then the browser is going to accept that DNS, that spoofed DNS response. So the problem is that originally, and this was like this for a while in DNS, that the ID was incremented with every request. So let's say Alice's browser made a DNS request, had some ID, then the next time it made the DNS request, had ID +1, next time ID +2, and so forth. So the ID was actually incrementing. So how can the attacker leverage this fact that the ID gets incremented in Alice's browser to figure out what the ID is? Yeah? Yeah, so you just visited their webpage, they could know what ID you just used. Yeah, the question is, that's very, very close. The question is, how did you get to their webpage? Did you make a DNS request to them or to some other name server that took you there? So usually, unless they're registered as a name server, you wouldn't necessarily query them for the DNS record, right? You would query them for the webpage. You'd go to that IP address and say, give me the webpage, but the name server could have been a different one. So you're very much on the right track. The idea is to make sure that you query them as a DNS name server. So what the attacker does is the following. They put in the same page another image whose source is badguy.com, which is, let's say, that the name server for that is actually owned by the attacker. Okay? So now the attacker owns a name server for badguy.com. Alice's browser is going to want to resolve this, so it's going to show up at that name server and say, hey, give me this IP address for this badguy.com. That's all legitimate. You know, an attacker can have a name server for their own domain. That's fine. But then the attacker is going to see what ID Alice used to get, to resolve this badguy.com. It's going to know her ID, and then it's going to infer that the ID for mail.google.com will be ID +1. Okay? So now the attacker knows everything he needs to know. He knows the ID, and he knows mail.google.com. So he's going to send a packet to Alice's browser saying, for this ID and mail.google.com, this is the IP address. And now Alice is going to trust that bad IP address. Okay? And this attacker was off path. This attacker wasn't between mail.google.com and Alice. It was completely off path. Is it clear? Yeah, question? Yeah, so let's say that the bad guy sets up a domain name called badguy.com. He registers his own server as the name server for badguy.com. So he goes to the TLD server.com, says, hey, I own the domain badguy.com. I bought it, it's mine. Please register my name server for badguy.com. That's perfectly legitimate. Everybody can can purchase a domain and then register a name server for that domain. Okay? The problem here is that by using that name server, the attacker is figuring out the ID of Alice's browser, and Alice is going to use ID +1 when she tries to resolve mail.google.com. So that moment, this attacker can send a spoofed DNS response for mail.google.com because it knows the ID. Yeah. Yeah, all you have to do is she has to show up on your webpage. Maybe you send her an email with some attractive URL. Click here for this or this, right? Users do these things. So you have to trick her to visit the attacker's webpage somehow. Maybe she browses for free movies, and she gets there. Yeah. The whole point of this specific attack is to spoof a fake IP address for mail.google.com. Why? Because Alice is now going to get an incorrect IP address for mail.google.com, and she's going to show up with that IP address which belongs to the attacker and insert her username and password for the mail, for Gmail. So in this particular case, the goal of the attacker is to get Alice to believe that mail.google.com is at an incorrect IP address for this specific case. And the attacker relies on Alice somehow visiting a bad page. The fact that you're visiting, let's say, a corrupted page shouldn't affect your experience with Gmail. That's why this is a problem. that, you can visit all kinds of bad pages, but they shouldn't have effects on the good pages. And this attack, by just visiting a bad page at one point, makes you, compromises your future visits to mail.google.com or to the bank.com similarly, or to whoever the attacker wants, because it can do the same thing for a bunch of other domain names. Yeah, question? Exactly. Yeah. Because Alice is trying to resolve mail.google.com, but the attacker responds with a spoofed DNS response, and because the attacker figured out the IP of Alice, the ID, because of the previous Okay? So the way people fix this is they have randomized the ID. Problem is that this ID is you don't have a lot of space in this packet, and they didn't want to change the layout of a packet. That's very, very hard to change the DNS protocol. So it's only 65,000 possible IDs. It's a bit better. It's still not perfect. It's better in the sense that now, if you choose a random ID, okay, so you choose a random ID from these 65,000 options, then it's hard for the attacker to guess it. The attacker could still try to spoof 65,000 responses, one for each ID, but it has to beat the original server's response, right? It has to arrive at Alice's. So the packet with the right ID has to arrive at Alice before the right packet. Okay? And there's a smaller chance that will happen. It can still happen, but there's a smaller chance that will happen. So